All right, section 9.2 is on graphs of polar equations. These graphs are crazy. They're super neat. They're all different. What we want to do is we want to change some things in the calculator, including our table set. Okay, so we're going to be doing this on polar graph paper. So if you go to your y equals, it's all y equals. So under mode, you need to go down and it's a function right now. We need to change it to polar. So down here, I'm going to change it to polar. And then anytime we're graphing, we're going to be graphing in radians. Okay. Same as when we graphed sine, cosine, tangent, all that kind of stuff before we graphed in radians. So you have radians, and then we are going to be in polar mode. Okay. So now when I go to my y equals, it's r equals. Okay. So changing the table set in the calculator. On the graph paper, it's going in increments of pi twelfths. So under my table set, I'm going to start at 0, and I'm going to go by pi twelfths. So again, table set is second window, and then I'm going to start at 0, and then it's going to change in increments of pi twelfths. So when I go to my table, which is what I'm going to use to graph, and granted, I don't have anything in there right now, this will be the first line, second line, third line, fourth line, fifth line, and then 1.57 is pi halves. Some of these are nice to write down, so when you're trying to guesstimate or go back and forth between the different things, it's good to know that 1.57 is pi halves. Of course, you all know that 3.14 is equal to pi, and so on and so forth. Same thing with 3 pi halves, and then with 2 pi, knowing the decimal approximations for those so that you can count and you can go through, okay? Another piece of information that you're going to want to have is on page 546 in your book. These are the different types of polar graphs that you're going to see, okay? We already graphed a circle with the center at the origin from 9,1, and we graphed a line. Now, remember, a line was theta equals. Notice your calculator doesn't do theta equals. Okay, those are not going to come up. There are circles. Notice these two are both cosine, and the diameter of the circle happens to be, and I'll call it the x-axis. It's not the x-axis because this is a polar coordinate, but you'll get the gist. Okay, so the diameter goes through the x-axis of these circles, okay? If the leading coefficient is positive, the circle's on the right-hand side. If the leading coefficient is negative, the circle's on the left-hand side. These are things that you don't have to have memorized, but they're good things to be able to know and recognize. My sine, r equals a sine of theta. These are centered on the, and again, I'll call it the y-axis. It's not the y-axis, okay? But sine, if your leading coefficient is positive, it's above. And if your leading coefficient is negative, it's below, okay? So then the other kind of graph that we had is if we just had plain old r equals 2, it was centered at the origin. These are all your circles. The next kind of graph, these are, and this is a funky little C with a tail on it, these are called limicons. You can have looped, you can have something called a cardioid, you can have one with a dimple, and you can have a convex limicon. There are 4 different kinds of limicons. The equation for these are either cosine or sine. Notice again with cosine, this is a cosine graph, and it's centered around the x-axis. And then another cosine, that center goes through, the x-axis goes through the center, okay? And then if it's sine, these two, notice the middle of the graph is around the y-axis, okay? So there's lots of symmetry stuff that they're talking about for these. If for this equation, A is less than B, it's going to have an inner loop. If A is equal to B, it's going to be a cardioid. If A is between B and 2B, again, You don't need to memorize these, okay? You can use this chart in your book when you're asked about what the things are, okay? And then the last one, if A is greater than or equal to 2B, it's a convex. The next kind of graph we have are roses. You can have roses that have 3 petals, 4 petals, 5 petals, 6, 7, 8, and so on, okay? Notice my sign graphs, and I'm going to take my odd petaled one, is symmetrical about the y-axis. This one is actually symmetrical about the, excuse me, the x and the y-axis. My cosine graph, I'm going to again go with my odd petaled one. This is symmetrical about the x-axis. My even petaled one is symmetrical about the x and the y-axis. Now, I'm going to go back to this number n here. If n is 2, I have 4 petals. If n is 4, I have 8 petals. If n is 3, I have 3 petals. And if n is 5, I have 5 petals, okay? So if you're saying, all right, if n is odd, that's the number of petals that I have. If n is even, I have twice as many petals. And if that's what you're thinking, that is correct, okay? And it says that right here as well. This one, lemniscetes. You can have a lemniscete that is horizontal or is diagonal, okay? All the rest of these graphs are all r equals. These are r squared equal. So when you put them in the calculator, you have to have the top and the bottom half per se. You have to have the plus or minus square root of this, okay? So you're going to have to put in 2 different equations into your your r equals, excuse me. So cosine, again, symmetrical about the x-axis. Again, it's not the x-axis. And then this one is going to be symmetrical about the origin. The last one, spiral of Archimedes. These have neither sine nor cosine. They just have an r and a theta. And these are going to give you a spiral, okay? If theta is greater than 0, it's going to spiral counterclockwise. If theta is less than 0, it's going to spiral it's going to start down here and go this way. They're both going in this direction. For all of these graphs, we're using the calculator. So for every single one, we're using the calculator, and you just have to go from your calculator to the paper. For all of these, they're going to ask you what kind of graph that you have. And in that case, you can look on here if you're not sure as far as the names are concerned. You do not have to have these memorized.